I traded every piece of my history, my grandmother's locket, my wedding ring, for a stack of cash, believing it would save my dying husband. I didn't know I was simply paying for his lie. The velvet was cold against my fingertips. It was the first thing I noticed. For 15 years, that jewelry box had been a treasure chest of warmth and light, a physical ledger of my life with Mark. Now it was a graveyard. The empty indentations where my engagement ring used to sit, the hollowed-out space that once cradled my grandmother's locket, the long, thin groove that held the diamond tennis bracelet Mark gave me for our first anniversary. They were all just ghosts of memories now. In my hand, clutched so tightly my knuckles were white, was a thick, crinkled envelope of cash. It felt obscene, a vulgar trade-off for pieces of my soul. But it was a trade I'd made without a second's hesitation. Because this cash, this pile of paper, was going to save my husband's life. It had started 3 months ago. The fatigue Mark couldn't shake. The way the vibrant life of the party man I married began to fade, like a photograph left in the sun. He'd come home from his construction management job, collapse on the sofa, and barely have the energy to speak. Doctors were baffled at first. They ran test after test, their faces growing longer and more somber with each visit. Finally, the diagnosis came: a rare, aggressive autoimmune disorder that was attacking his nervous system. The kind of thing you read about in medical journals, not the kind that happens to your 38-year-old husband who could lift you up with one arm. The standard treatments weren't working. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. The man who used to carry me up the stairs after I'd had too much wine now struggled to hold a coffee mug. His laughter, the sound that had been the background music of my entire adult life, had become a weak, rattling cough. Then, a glimmer of hope. A specialist in another state was pioneering an experimental treatment. It was new, it was risky, and it wasn't covered by our insurance. The cost was astronomical. $100,000 up front just to get him into the program. We drained our savings in a week, cashed out our retirement accounts. It still wasn't enough. We were $30,000 short. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills, the final notice from the hospital finance department sitting on top like a tombstone. Mark was upstairs, asleep, hopefully dreaming of a time when his body wasn't at war with itself. I looked at my hands, at the diamond on my finger that he'd slipped on during a clumsy, beautiful proposal on a rainy Tuesday. I looked at the locket around my neck, the worn silver containing tiny, faded pictures of my grandparents. And I knew what I had to do. Selling it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The pawnbroker, a man with disinterested eyes, barely glanced at the stories I was laying on his glass counter. He saw carats and weight, not the first dance, not the graduation gift, not the last piece of my grandmother I had left. He gave me a lowball offer, and I took it without arguing. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. Dignity was a currency that couldn't buy my husband another day. I walked out of that shop feeling hollowed out, but with the $30,000 we needed. Now, standing in the sterile, antiseptic-smelling hallway of the hospital, the weight of that sacrifice felt worth it. The envelope in my hand was a ticket to more time, more laughter, more life with Mark. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of fierce, protective love. I did it. I had bridged the gap. I had saved him. I just wanted to burst into his room, to hold his hand and tell him that everything was going to be okay, that he didn't have to worry anymore. His room 304 was just ahead. The door was slightly ajar. As I got closer, I heard voices from inside. One was Mark's, but it sounded different, stronger, clearer than it had been in weeks. Not the weak, raspy voice of a sick man. A knot of confusion tightened in my stomach. The other voice was sharp, familiar, and immediately set my teeth on edge. It was my mother-in-law, Brenda. She'd always had a way of making me feel small, but she'd been a pillar of supposed support these last few months, always talking about how we needed to do whatever it took to save her son. I slowed my steps, my heart starting to pound a strange, discordant rhythm against my ribs. I shouldn't eavesdrop, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. "Are you sure she went through with it?" Brenda's voice was a low, venom-laced whisper. All of it. There was a short, almost smug-sounding chuckle from Mark. A sound I hadn't heard in so long, but it didn't fill me with relief. It filled me with ice. Every last piece, he said, his voice brimming with a strange energy. You should have seen her face when she was talking about it. She even sold her grandmother's locket. Poor thing looked like she was about to cry. My breath caught in my throat. Why was he talking like that? So dismissive, so cold. Brenda sighed, a sound of theatrical satisfaction. Well, it's done then. It was a miserable, ugly thing anyway. What matters is that you got it. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into my veins. Got what? What were they talking about? I pressed my ear closer to the crack in the door, the envelope of cash suddenly feeling like it was burning a hole through my skin. Then I heard Mark's voice again, clear as a bell, full of a chilling, triumphant finality that shattered my world into a million pieces. It's more than enough, he said. The down payment is secured. We can finally get the house. The house. The words echoed in the cavern of my skull, ricocheting off the sudden, shocking emptiness inside me. The house. The one on Elm Street with the wraparound porch and the ancient oak tree in the backyard. The one we'd driven past 100 times. The one Mark had sighed over, calling it our someday house. Someday, when we hit the lottery, he'd always say with a sad smile. It seemed he'd found a different kind of lottery, me. My love, my trust, my history melted down for a down payment. For a moment, I couldn't move. My feet were fused to the linoleum floor. The bustling sounds of the hospital, the distant beep of a monitor, the squeak of a nurse's shoes, the low hum of the ventilation, all faded into a dull, roaring silence in my ears. The envelope in my hand, once a symbol of my sacrifice and hope, now felt like it was filled with acid, burning through my skin. My entire body went cold, a glacial numbness spreading from my chest outwards, freezing the very air in my lungs. I had to get away. If they opened that door and saw me, if Mark looked at me with those lying eyes, I didn't know what I would do. I might scream, I might collapse, or I might do something much, much worse. I backed away, my steps clumsy and silent, like a thief in my own life. I moved down the hallway, turning corner after corner, a blind animal seeking a dark place to hide. I found an empty family waiting room, the air stale with the ghosts of other people's anxieties. The chairs were upholstered in a faded, depressing floral pattern. I sank into one, the cheap fabric rough against my cheeks as I buried my face in my hands. The tears wouldn't come. I was too far beyond tears. This was a different kind of grief, a hollow, echoing chasm where a 15-year marriage used to be. Every memory began to respool in my mind, but now viewed through this new, sickening lens. His fatigue. Was it just him staying up late, planning this? The doctor's appointments he insisted on going to alone, saying he didn't want me to see him so weak. The vague test results he'd relay with a pained expression. Papers he never actually let me see, always claiming the specialist's office would send copies later that never arrived. The experimental treatment with no name, at a clinic with no website, recommended by a colleague of a doctor we'd never met. The red flags were a roaring bonfire, and I had been standing in the middle of it, willfully blind, convinced I was only feeling the warmth of my own love. And Brenda. Oh God, Brenda. Her cloying sympathy. The way she'd hold my hand and tell me I was such a strong woman. The little comments she'd make while looking at my jewelry. That bracelet must be worth a pretty penny, she'd said once, just weeks ago, her eyes gleaming. But of course, you can't put a price on family. She was right. They had put a price on me, and the price was a 3-bedroom house with a 2-car garage. A hot, metallic taste filled my mouth. It was rage. Pure, undiluted, and terrifyingly calm. The hollow space inside me began to fill with it, a molten core of fury. The woman who had walked out of that pawn shop, heartbroken but resolute, was gone. She had died in the hallway outside room 304. I didn't know who this new woman was, the one sitting in her place, but she was not weak. She was not a victim, and she was not going to let them get away with this. I sat up straight, I looked down at the envelope in my lap.
Tire-t-il tous en dollars.
My past, my heritage, my grandmother's love, all converted into cash. They thought it was for them. They thought it was the final piece of their perfect, cruel puzzle. They were wrong. This wasn't their down payment anymore. This was my war chest. My mind started working, gears grinding, lubricated by adrenaline and ice-cold fury. What was their plan? They'd fake a miracle recovery, of course. The experimental treatment would be a rousing success. Mark would come home, a new man. We'd celebrate. And then, a few weeks later, he'd sit me down and tell me about the incredible investment opportunity his mother had found for us. They'd present the house as a fresh start, a reward for everything we'd endured together. They would let me live in a house bought with the pieces of my heart, and they would watch me every single day and laugh. The thought was so vile it almost made me gag. No, absolutely not. My hand went to my purse, my fingers closing around the cool metal of my phone. I needed proof. I needed more than just a conversation I'd overheard. I needed to see it. I needed to document it. I needed to burn their lies to the ground with undeniable, irrefutable truth. I stood up, my movements now precise and deliberate. The shock had solidified into a diamond-hard purpose. I walked back the way I came, my footsteps silent, my posture straight. I was no longer the worried wife coming to pay for her husband's treatment. I was an executioner walking towards the gallows. I reached room 304. The door was still ajar. My heart was a steady, heavy drum against my ribs. I peered through the crack. The sight stole the breath from my lungs all over again. Mark wasn't in the bed. He was standing by the window, fully dressed in jeans and a polo shirt, stretching his arms over his head like he'd just woken from a pleasant nap. Brenda was sitting in the visitor's chair, scrolling through something on her phone, a wide, smug smile on her face. She tilted the screen towards him. "Look, they just lowered the price by $5,000, she said, her voice dripping with glee. "It's a sign." Mark laughed, a full, healthy, robust laugh that echoed with betrayal. He walked over to her, leaned down, and kissed her on the cheek. "You're a genius, Mom," he said. "Always were." They were celebrating. On the hospital bed where he was supposed to be dying, they were celebrating the destruction of my life. My grief, my sacrifice, it was a joke to them, a means to an end. My hand didn't shake. My vision didn't blur. Everything became crystal clear. I slowly, carefully, pulled my phone from my purse, angling it through the narrow gap in the door. I raised my phone, my hand as steady as a surgeon's, and I pressed record. The red recording dot on my phone screen glowed like a malevolent eye. It felt like an extension of my own rage, a silent, digital witness to the grotesque theater playing out in that room. I held my breath, angling the phone to capture both of them in the frame. Mark, looking disgustingly healthy, leaning over his mother's shoulder. Brenda, her face alight with avarice as she swiped through pictures of my house. The house bought with my grandmother's locket, with the pearls my father gave me on my wedding day, with the ring Mark himself had placed on my finger while promising to love and cherish me forever. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost surreal. "The closing can be as soon as we wire the down payment," Brenda was saying, her voice a conspiratorial murmur that my phone's microphone picked up with perfect clarity. "The agent said since it's a cash offer, we can expedite everything. We could have the keys in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. Mark straightened up, a thoughtful frown on his face. Not a frown of guilt or remorse, but one of logistics. What am I supposed to do until then? I can't just be miraculously cured overnight. Sarah's not an idiot. A bitter, humorless laugh threatened to bubble up from my chest. "Oh, you have no idea how wrong you are, Mark. I had been an idiot, the biggest idiot in the world. But my tenure in that role had officially ended about 10 minutes ago." "Don't you worry about that," Brenda waved a dismissive hand. "We'll just say the initial phase of the treatment worked faster than expected. We'll have you discharged tomorrow for at-home recovery. You just have to keep up the act for a little while longer. Look a bit tired, walk a little slower. Your wife is so blinded by her love for you, she'll believe anything you say." She always has. The casual cruelty of her words sliced deeper than any insult ever could. They weren't just deceiving me. They were banking on my love for Mark as the cornerstone of their entire plan. They were weaponizing my own heart against me. I felt a tremor go through my hand, but I forced it steady. I couldn't afford a single shaky frame. This video was my only weapon. I recorded for another 2 minutes, a silent eternity in which they discussed landscaping ideas and which room would be Brenda's when she came to stay. Every word was another nail in their coffin. When I was sure I had more than enough, I carefully lowered the phone, stopped the recording, and saved the file to a secure cloud drive before deleting the original from my device. No chances. I backed away from the door again, melting back into the hospital corridor. My mind was a whirlwind, but a cold, calm center had formed. The initial shock had burned away, leaving behind a chilling clarity. I wasn't just going to expose them. That felt too simple, too clean. I wanted them to feel a fraction of the humiliation, the devastation that they had so gleefully inflicted upon me. They wanted a house? Fine. I would make sure they got a house. A house of cards built on a foundation of lies, and I was going to be the one to kick it over. I walked straight to the hospital's financial services office, the envelope of cash clutched in my hand. A woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Cynthia looked up as I approached her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yes," I said, my own voice surprisingly even. "I'm here to make a payment for my husband, Mark Peterson, in room 304. I pushed the envelope across the counter. Cynthia's eyebrows raised slightly as she saw the thick stack of bills. She counted it methodically, her machine whirring softly. $30,000, she confirmed, looking at me. "Ma'am, your husband's bill isn't due yet. And this is a significant overpayment. His accumulated charges so far are only for a few standard diagnostic tests, around $2,000. I feigned confusion. "Oh, but what about the experimental treatment? We were told we had to pay $100,000 up front. This is the final portion of that." Cynthia frowned, tapping at her keyboard. "Experimental treatment? Ma'am, there's nothing on Mr. Peterson's chart about that. He was admitted for observation due to reported symptoms of chronic fatigue. Dr. Miller hasn't scheduled any procedures. In fact," she peered closer at her screen, "he was scheduled for discharge this afternoon until his wife called this morning and insisted he stay for more tests." The blood drained from my face. I was the one who called. After Mark had a particularly theatrical, weak spell last night, I'd called the nursing station in a panic, begging them to keep him, to run every test they could think of. I had insisted. I had extended his stay, giving him more time to play the victim while I ran around frantically selling my life. I had, in effect, helped him defraud me. I see, I stammered, feeling a fresh wave of nausea. I had to pivot. Fast. There must be some confusion. My mother-in-law was handling the arrangements with the specialist. Perhaps the payment is for an external facility. Cynthia gave me a sympathetic look. "It's possible, but we have no record of a transfer or any coordination with an outside specialist. Do you still want to apply this full amount to his account?" "No," I said, my mind racing. "No, actually, can you just apply what's owed? The $2,000? "Of course." She efficiently separated the bills and slid the remaining $28,000 back to me, along with a receipt for my payment. I took the cash and the receipt, my thoughts spinning. This was even better. The scam was bigger and bolder than I thought. There was no treatment. There was no specialist. There wasn't even a real, significant medical bill. The entire $100,000, our savings, our retirement, and my jewelry, was going straight to their dream house. They hadn't even bothered to create a convincing paper trail. They were that certain of my gullibility. I walked out of the finance office with a plan taking shape, sharp and brutal. They wanted to play a game? We'd play. I went to the hospital gift shop and bought the most extravagant bouquet of lilies they had. Funereal, I thought with grim satisfaction, and a get-well-soon balloon that looked ridiculously cheerful. I needed to make my entrance. I needed to see their faces. Walking back towards room 304, my heart wasn't pounding with fear anymore. It was beating with a slow, powerful rhythm, like a war drum. I had $28,000 in my purse, a receipt for a $2,000 hospital bill, and a video that could ruin them. The game was on. I stopped outside the door, took a deep, steadying breath, plastered the most loving, relieved smile I could manage onto my face, and pushed the door open. "Mark, darling," I chirped, stepping inside. "I have the most wonderful news." Mark, who had been laughing at something on Brenda's phone, whipped his head around. The color drained from his face. Brenda looked up, her smug smile freezing and cracking like cheap porcelain. They looked at me, then at the massive bouquet in my arms, and then back at me, their eyes wide with panic. They looked like two cockroaches caught in a sudden, blinding light. I walked towards the bed, my smile never wavering, and set the flowers down on the bedside table with a flourish. I looked my husband, my perfectly healthy, traitorous husband, dead in the eye. "I did it, honey," I said, my voice dripping with false adoration. "I got the money. We can pay for the treatment. But you'll never guess who I ran into in the finance office just now. Your doctor, Dr. Miller. He told me the most interesting thing." Mark's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He darted a wild-eyed glance at his mother, whose own expression had curdled into a tight, venomous grimace. The air in the room crackled with a sudden, suffocating tension. The cheerful "get well soon" balloon bobbed mockingly above my head, a stark contrast to the glacial atmosphere that had descended. I let the silence hang there for a beat longer, savoring the frantic ticking I could practically hear inside their heads as they scrambled to figure out what I knew. "Dr. Miller?" Mark finally managed to choke out, his voice a full octave higher than usual. He tried to force a weak, sickly smile, but it was a gruesome, twitching thing. "Oh yeah, him. Good man. What did he say?" "Well, it was just the most incredible coincidence," I continued, my voice bright and bubbly, each cheerful word a deliberate twist of the knife. I walked over and sat on the edge of his hospital bed, placing my hand gently on his leg. He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I felt it. He was just so thrilled. He said he'd just gotten off the phone with the specialist, the one in charge of your experimental treatment. He said the preliminary results from your latest scans came in, and they've never seen anything like it. I leaned in closer, forcing him to meet my gaze. My smile was wide, but my eyes were cold steel. He said you don't need the treatment anymore, Mark. He said it's a miracle. Your body, it's fighting it off on its own. You're in spontaneous remission. The lie was absurd, a ridiculous fabrication built on top of their own. But in their panic state, it was just plausible enough to throw them completely off balance. I watched as a flicker of confusion, then dawning, desperate hope crossed Mark's face. Could he get out of this so easily? Could this fictional miracle save him from the hole he dug? Brenda, ever the quicker of the two, narrowed her eyes. She smelled a trap. "Remission?" she repeated, her voice sharp and suspicious. "That's impossible. He was deteriorating just yesterday." "I know," I exclaimed, turning my beaming face to her. "That's what makes it a one-in-a-million medical event. Dr. Miller said they're going to write a paper about it. He said Mark can be discharged first thing in the morning. We can go home." I clapped my hands together in feigned delight, my eyes shining with unshed, furious tears. Isn't it the most wonderful news? All that worrying, all that sacrifice, it was all for nothing. We get to keep our money. I let that last sentence land with a soft, devastating thud. Mark's face, which had been tentatively hopeful, collapsed. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin, white line. Their dream of a wraparound porch and an oak tree was dissolving before their very eyes, and they had to sit there and pretend to be thrilled about it. "Our money," Mark stammered. "Yes, silly," I laughed, reaching into my purse and pulling out the thick envelope of cash. The $28,000 that was left. I waved it in front of his face. I was just about to pay the full amount when Dr. Miller stopped me. We only owed for a few nights of observation, so I kept it. This plus all of our savings, we can put it all back. We can rebuild. It's a fresh start, a second chance at life. The performance was draining me, but the sight of their crestfallen, horrified faces was a potent fuel. They were trapped. To deny the miracle would be to admit they were lying about the illness in the first place. They had no choice but to play along with the joyful narrative I was spinning, even as it strangled their greedy aspirations. "Oh, honey, that's just—" Mark struggled for words, his eyes fixed on the envelope in my hand. He looked like a starving man watching a feast being carried away. "Incredible," Brenda finished for him, her voice strained. She forced a smile that looked more like a snarl. "We are so blessed. We absolutely are." I agreed, my own smile feeling sharp enough to draw blood. "And you know what? We should celebrate properly. Why don't you come over for dinner tomorrow night, Brenda, to celebrate Mark's miraculous recovery? We'll open a bottle of that expensive champagne we were saving." It was an invitation, but it sounded like a summons. A challenge. Brenda's eyes met mine over Mark's head. In that moment, she knew that I knew. Maybe not everything, but she knew the game had changed. The mouse had suddenly grown teeth. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold, appraising stare. "Of course," she said slowly. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The next 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I brought Mark home from the hospital, fussing over him with suffocating sweetness. I made him lie on the couch with a blanket, bringing him tea and soup, all while talking endlessly about how lucky we were, how we dodged a bullet, how wonderful it would be to put the money from my jewelry back into a high-interest savings account. I watched him squirm, forced to play the part of the grateful, recovering patient while his dreams of ill-gotten real estate slipped further and further away. Brenda arrived for dinner precisely at 7, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral. The air in our small home was thick with unspoken truths. I served the meal I had spent all day preparing, a lavish spread of all of Mark's favorite foods. I was the perfect, doting wife. We ate in near silence, the clinking of our forks against the plates unnaturally loud. Finally, after clearing the dessert plates, I stood at the head of the table. "I have one more surprise," I announced, my voice steady. "A little something to commemorate this momentous occasion." Mark and Brenda exchanged a nervous glance. I walked over to the television in the living room, a USB stick clutched in my hand. My heart was a cold, hard knot in my chest. This was it. The performance was over. "You know," I said, turning back to face them, my voice losing its saccharine edge and dropping into a low, dangerous register. "I was thinking today about sacrifice, about what it means to give up everything for someone you love. I thought I knew." I looked directly at Mark. He visibly shrank back in his chair. But then I realized some people don't see sacrifice. They just see an opportunity. "Sarah, what is this about?" Brenda snapped, her composure finally breaking. "This," I said, as I plugged the USB into the television, "is about the truth." I hit play. The screen flickered to life. The first thing they saw was a crystal-clear image of Mark's hospital room. The first thing they heard was Brenda's voice, sharp and clear. "Are you sure she went through with it? All of it?" Mark let out a strangled gasp. Brenda shot to her feet, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Turn it off," she hissed. "Turn it off right now." But I just stood there, my arms crossed, and watched as their perfect, cruel world began to burn. The video played on, every damning word, every smug laugh, every mention of the down payment and the house, filling the silent room. Mark buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Brenda stood frozen, her mouth agape, her eyes locked on the screen in horror. The video ended with the shot of them laughing together, celebrating my heartbreak. I let the silence descend once more, thick and heavy with their guilt. Then I turned to them, my face devoid of all emotion. "The house on Elm Street," I said, my voice as cold and empty as the jewelry box on my dresser. "The closing is in 2 weeks, I believe. Don't worry. I wouldn't want you to miss it. In fact, I've already sent a copy of this video to the real estate agent. And to a very good lawyer. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. And just for good measure, I also sent it to the rest of the family. Uncle Robert, Aunt Carol, your cousin Steve. I think they'll all be very interested to hear about Mark's miraculous recovery. The aftermath was not a loud explosion, but a deafening, implosive silence. Brenda collapsed back into her chair as if her bones had turned to dust, her face the color of ash. Mark didn't even look up. He just kept his face buried in his hands, making a low, wounded sound like a dying animal. The faces on the television, their own triumphant, mocking faces, seemed to watch them from the screen, ghosts of a victory that had turned to poison. "How could you?" Brenda whispered, the words barely audible. It was a testament to her spectacular narcissism that her first thought wasn't of remorse, but of how I could have possibly outsmarted her. How could I dash? I let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. That's the question you're asking? You and your son conspired to steal my future. You faked a terminal illness, let me sell heirlooms from my dead grandmother, and planned to let me live in a house bought with my own grief. You're asking me how I could. I walked over to the dining table and picked up my wine glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes never leaving them. The wine tasted like victory. The better question, I continued, setting the glass down with a soft click, is what you're going to do now. The answer, it turned out, was nothing. They were paralyzed. My threat hadn't just been about the house or the money. I had gone for the jugular, their reputation. Brenda, who prided herself on being the matriarch, the respected elder of the family. Mark, who had always cultivated an image as the charming, stand-up guy. I hadn't just exposed a crime, I had exposed their very character. The video I'd sent to our relatives was a social atom bomb, and the fallout was already beginning. Mark's phone, sitting on the table, began to buzz. The screen lit up with a picture of his Uncle Robert. Mark flinched as if the phone had burned him. He didn't answer. A moment later, it buzzed again. His Aunt Carol. Then a flurry of text message notifications began to pop up, one after another. A digital hailstorm of condemnation. You should probably answer that, I said calmly. They're going to have questions. Brenda finally found her voice, and with it, her venom. You'll regret this, you manipulative little. Don't. I cut her off, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Don't you dare finish that sentence. You have no idea what I'm capable of now. You wanted to see me broken? You succeeded. You broke me, but you just put the pieces back together into something you won't like. Now, get out of my house. It wasn't their house. It would never be their house. It was mine, paid for with my salary, my efforts, and my now shattered dreams. Brenda stood, her movements stiff, and pulled a still sobbing Mark up from his chair. She didn't look at me as they shuffled towards the door, a pathetic and defeated pair. Just before she left, she turned back, her eyes filled with an impotent, bottomless hatred. He loved you, she hissed. No, I replied, the truth of it settling in my soul with a strange, peaceful finality. He loved what I did for him. There's a difference. And then they were gone. The silence they left behind was clean. It was the sound of a fever breaking, of a poison being purged. I stood alone in my living room, the damning video still frozen on the screen. I didn't cry. I just breathed. For the first time in months, it felt like my own air, in my own lungs, in my own life. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. I met with the lawyer I had contacted, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Davies. She watched the video with a grimly satisfied expression. When I explained the full scope of the fraud, the savings, the retirement funds, everything, she laid out a plan. We filed for divorce immediately, citing fraud. The video was our Exhibit A. We also filed a civil suit against both Mark and Brenda for the funds they had deceitfully acquired. The threat of criminal charges for fraud was left hanging in the air, a powerful bargaining chip. They didn't fight it. They couldn't. Their family had completely ostracized them. The real estate agent, horrified, had terminated their offer on the house and forwarded my lawyer's email to the local board, effectively blacklisting them. They were pariahs. Mark signed the divorce papers without contest. The judge, having been briefed on the circumstances, awarded me the house, the car, and a full restitution of every penny they had taken from our joint accounts and my retirement. The money from my jewelry was harder to quantify in legal terms, but the settlement for emotional distress was significant. One of the hardest calls I had to make was to the pawnbroker. I went back to his shop, the legal settlement paperwork in my purse. I showed him the photo of my grandmother's locket. His face was as disinterested as it had been before. "Lady, I see 100 pieces like this a week. It's probably been melted down by now," he grunted. My heart sank, but I had to try. "Please," I said, my voice thick. "It's silver, not worth much in weight. It has a tiny dent on the back, right by the clasp. It contains 2 very faded pictures." He sighed, annoyed, but something in my face must have moved him. He disappeared into the back for what felt like an eternity. When he returned, he was holding it. My locket. It was tarnished and sitting in a dusty tray with other forgotten trinkets. But it was there. My hands trembled as I took it from him. I paid him 3 times what he gave me for it, and I didn't care. Holding its familiar weight in my palm, I felt a piece of my soul click back into place. I couldn't get everything back, but I got her back. 6 months later, I sold the house. It had too many ghosts. I used the money from the sale and the settlement to buy a small condo in a new part of the city, a place with no memories of Mark. I started my own small business, a freelance graphic design company I'd always dreamed of. It was terrifying and exhilarating. I was standing on my own 2 feet, truly, for the first time in my life. I sometimes hear things about Mark and Brenda. They had to sell her house to pay the restitution and legal fees. They moved to a different state, disgraced. The last I heard, Mark was working a menial job, his charm having run out of currency. I don't feel anger when I think of them anymore. I don't feel much of anything. They are just characters in a story from a life that no longer belongs to me. Tonight, I'm sitting on my new balcony, which overlooks the city lights. My grandmother's locket is warm against my skin. The empty indentations in my jewelry box have been filled with new pieces. Not extravagant ones, but small silver things I bought for myself to mark milestones in my new life. Landing my first big client, my first solo vacation, my first year of being free. Each one a memory that is wholly and completely my own. I traded my past for a future, but it wasn't the one Mark had planned. It's the one I built for myself, from the ashes. And it is beautiful.